Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. There have been some real dream matchups throughout the years: Alien vs Predator, Marvel vs DC, Garfield vs Heathcliff, and of course everyone's favourite robot mass murderers, RoboCop vs the Terminator. Both franchises were huge in the 80s, and there was actually a comic book tie-in that pit the two metal macho men against each other. And yeah, we even got video games based on that comic book too. So, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna shut up, you press that subscribe button, and let's look at some games. There's even a bonus one at the end for you. We are going to start on the Sega Master System, as this is the version of the game I had growing up as a kid. You play as RoboCop, who is of course the good guy, seeing as he wants to uphold the law, and the Terminators want to wipe out mankind. There is a slightly convoluted story that's described in a text crawl at the start of the game, where essentially Skynet is doing its usual thing and RoboCop finds out, and while he's on patrol one day comes across a Terminator. Turns out Skynet wants to use the tech that made RoboCop to help their efforts, and when RoboCop plugs himself into that weird computer thing he's got, it gives Skynet all the info they need. So RoboCop then has to travel into the future, sometimes using the same technology as the Terminators, sometimes he just uploads himself to the computer and rebuilds himself in the future, depends which version of the game you play. And then his mission is only then to take down Skynet. As you can see, the game plays as a side-scrolling action game, and amazingly, it plays pretty damn well. RoboCop has to navigate a ton of levels, including the streets of Detroit, junkyards, chemical plants, as well as the OCP building, before being sent to the future, where you fight through rebel bases that have been overrun by Terminators, and eventually you end up in Skynet HQ, where you take them down once and for all. You'll be fighting a ton of enemies on the levels. While we're in the past, these are mainly consisting of regular human scum who will attack you with various guns, molotovs and so on. You have to be on your guard as they'll pop out of windows in what must be a nod to the arcade game, which is a really nice touch. Luckily, you can shoot in just about every direction, which really helps take them down. The enemies are actually quite easy though, and most of them only take one hit to kill, and you'll love killing the enemies here as they explode into a bloody pulp that would put Mortal Kombat to shame. I remember seeing this for the first time and thinking it was the coolest thing ever, and also it does fit with the ultra violence of the original RoboCop movies. You also get a few weapons to use. You've got your standard pistol that's pretty effective against most things, but then you'll want to collect the laser or rocket weapons that you'll find in the levels, as these do massive damage and are especially good against the bosses. And speaking of bosses, these are some pretty cool fights, but they are actually kind of easy. I only realised this on this playthrough, but most of the bosses don't actually move. They just stay in one place firing a pattern of bullets at you, and if you just manage to get to bosses with full health, you can pretty much just stand still and fire at them and you'll win in just a few seconds. Though this doesn't work for all bosses, and only really if you've got the rocket or laser weapons. They are still cool though, with the Terminator being a boss early on, as well as Ed 209 and a few other robot bastards. The levels set in the past also have a few things like gun turrets that you'll need to watch out for, as well as fire and chemical hazards in some levels that can almost kill you instantly. Thankfully, controlling RoboCop is good. You can walk, jump and climb, and RoboCop is actually pretty nippy. Pressing up and then jump lets you do a high jump, and you'll need to do this to get over some of the larger hazards and collect some items that are just about out of reach. RoboCop can also cling onto certain pipes and shimmy across. This is used quite a lot in the game, and while it doesn't seem like something RoboCop would do, I kinda like it. Graphically, the game is great. RoboCop and the enemies all look very good, and RoboCop animates well. The backgrounds aren't bad, but I did find that the further into the game I got, the less detail there seemed to be. However, there is a good variety of past and future locations. When you're in the future, you'll spend most of your time fighting Terminators and other robot menaces. In fact, you spend your whole time doing that. And these are actually still surprisingly easy to kill, especially if you do have that rocket or laser weapon that I keep banging on about. Shoot them a few times and they'll fall over, but just keep shooting, and when they get back up, you'll immediately hit them again. Often, if you're just walking while constantly shooting, you'll kill pretty much any enemy before you even see them on screen. In fact, that's one of my few criticisms of this game, is that it's actually pretty damn easy. I hadn't played this for a few years, and I actually managed to complete the whole thing on my first playthrough in about 40 minutes, and I only died 3 or 4 times, and most of those were because of some dodgy collision detection on the fire pits that kill you pretty much instantly. Something that is an issue though is the amount of flicker. Thanks to the large sprites and the amount of stuff on screen at once, it does cause a lot of sprite flicker, meaning that enemy bullets often disappear, so you'll take a lot of damage because you can't actually see the bullets coming at you, which isn't your fault. Thankfully there are a few health kits, lives and even shields you can collect on the levels, so it is kind of fair. Also, thankfully when you die, you get right back up from where you died, so you don't have to do any backtracking. Overall, I still really enjoy this game. It looks great and plays well. It does have some minor flaws, but nothing game breaking. I would definitely recommend checking this one out. The Game Gear version of RoboCop vs Terminator is a port of the Master System version, and for the most part it's pretty faithful, but it also has some issues that make it just not quite as good to play. In terms of gameplay, it is almost identical. The levels are the same, though it does seem like there's a few new enemies that have been introduced, like blokes that hide around corners and pop out at various intervals. The controls are solid and you move quickly most of the time. Graphically, it's still decent, with large sprites and exploding enemies, but it is a little more pixelated and zoomed in, as you'd expect for the Game Gear. Music and sound are basically identical to the Master System version 2, which means they're not bad, but there are some strange sound effects in here, and the music that you hear when you complete a level just really seems out of place. However, the smaller hardware just doesn't seem to be able to handle the game quite as well. The game is noticeably choppier when moving and jumping, even the scrolling isn't as smooth. There's a lot of slowdown all of the time, especially with the amount of projectiles on screen basically forever. Not that you'd know they were there, as the flicker is really bad here. Now for some reason it doesn't tend to affect any character sprites this much in this version, but instead almost every bullet that comes from an enemy just disappears, making it really tough not to take damage. And I swear there was times where the health power-ups also disappeared before I'd managed to collect them. This can be especially problematic, especially when you're fighting bosses who fire a ton of shots at you and you only have a small window to dodge them. Thankfully in the levels you do still get a fair few health power-ups when they bother staying there, and something I didn't mention before is that you also get some secondary objectives in a few of the levels, your first objective of course being to get to the end and beat the boss. These secondary objectives are things like rescuing hostages and destroying security cameras. What's cool is that every time you do rescue a hostage or something like that, your health is refilled. I like this as it does keep things fair. Until you get to the bosses, and then it's basically impossible not to take damage. I actually did manage to get to the final boss here, but I just could not beat it, thanks to the bullshit disappearing bullets. I had no idea where I needed to dodge, and I was pretty much wiped out instantly. It's a shame. Overall, this version is okay, but the choppiness, slowdown and disappearing bullets make it hard to recommend over the Master System version. The Mega Drive version, or Genesis if you're Keith from the Main Quest podcast, is the real deal though. This is a similar, but not the same as Master System version, and of course it's better in just about every way. Graphically, the game looks amazing, with massive detailed sprites that have a ton of animation. The levels all look great with a load of detail and some nice backgrounds. The enemies all look good too, and this time they explode with even more blood and guts, and it just looks great. There's been a few additions here as well. There's some extra levels and a few extra enemies, mainly in the form of different coloured Terminators that are tougher to kill, and they've also added a load of new weapons. You still have your standard pistol, but you can collect rocket launchers, spread guns, laser pistols, rifles and even a grenade launcher that's one of the strangest weapons you can get, as it fires grenades that you then control with the D-pad. It's such a strange addition, but I love it. You can have dozens of grenades surrounding you at any point, which you can then just almost use as a shield. When you're in the future, you get some weapons that are specific to that time period too. Basically a couple more laser pistols, but there's also a really powerful one that takes out most Terminators in just 1 or 2 shots. You definitely want to keep hold of that. And what's good is that you can now actually carry 2 weapons at a time, and you can switch between them on the fly. This is a very handy mechanic. When you collect a new weapon, it always replaces the one that you're not using, which I like, as it tends to be that you're using your favourite one the whole time. Also, when you die, you only lose the weapon that you're holding at the time. So what I would do is use my favourite weapon, but then if I get low on health, switch to the other one, so if I do die, I've still got it. This even works if your other weapon is just your default pistol. Another big change here are the bosses. Now these are actually pretty much the same bosses, but here they do actually move around quite a lot, and you've got much larger arenas to fight them in, sometimes requiring some platforming and hanging from pipes. These boss fights are actually really tough, and the game is a lot harder than the 8-bit versions. In fact, regular enemies are tougher too, especially the Terminators, though it is still a fair challenge, as you do get your health points, lives, shields and stuff like that in the levels, and you also get extra lives for every 10,000 points you get. They've really gone to town on the soundtrack here too, and I really like it, with some cool industrial sounding beats playing all the way through. It's very 90s. In terms of negatives, there really isn't that much for me to complain about here. It's one of those games where your health does constantly go down if you're touching a hazard, meaning there are instances where you'll die just immediately when you touch something. That can be annoying, but for me, there really wasn't much else that I didn't like. Some of the levels can be a bit confusing, as they're quite maze-like, but they aren't massive, and you just have to remember to press up on doors or anything that even resembles a door, as you might be able to enter it. Also, some levels have paths behind walls, and you'll need to try walking through walls quite a lot, which makes you look like an idiot when they're not a secret wall. Other than that though, this is a freaking awesome action game that I did manage to beat on my first try. It took me about an hour and 20 minutes, but I had a smile on my face the whole time. The last boss is pretty damn tough actually, so watch out for that, and it goes on forever. And yeah, it is just a giant floating Terminator head, which is a bit of a letdown, but ah well. This game is a must-have if you ask me. RoboCop vs Terminator was very different for Nintendo owners. Here is the Game Boy version. The story is of course the same. You still play as RoboCop in a side-scrolling action game where you go through the streets of Detroit, eventually making your way to the OCP headquarters and then into the future to take out the Terminators once and for all. The game looks okay, and RoboCop looks like RoboCop. You get a load of enemies all over the place, and this time they just explode, but not in a shower of blood. Also, you have to contend with such things as giant spiders that you'll meet in the Detroit sewers. Not sure why they needed to include these, but hey, I've never been to Detroit, maybe it's accurate. Controlling RoboCop is good and responsive. Again, you can walk, jump and climb. Now can someone tell me if I've missed something here? Is RoboCop famous for his monkey bar skills or something? They're obsessed with it in this game, but I really don't remember it in any of the films. Anyway, you can shoot straight ahead or upwards at an angle here. This is handy, but I would have liked to have been able to shoot in pretty much any direction like the other games, but for some reason you can't. Oh well. What's annoying is that you can only shoot 2 bullets on screen at once. Then you have to wait for them to leave the screen to be able to shoot again. This can make it very hard to hit enemies as they move a lot, and there's a surprising amount of flying enemies in the game which are pretty tricky to hit. I only found one other weapon in the game, which is a 3-way shot that fires the times symbol. It's kinda useful, but has quite limited ammo, and I only found it 2 or 3 times in the whole game. Though I guess that's quite a lot considering how short this game is. But that was kind of the thing with a lot of Game Boy games. They were deliberately shorter experiences, so you could play through them in one sitting. Which is what I did here. This was the first time I'd played this version, and I actually managed to beat it in about half an hour. There's only a handful of levels, and it's actually pretty damn easy. Though I wouldn't say it's a bad game. Fighting the Terminators is pretty cool, and I did enjoy most of the boss fights, even if they were incredibly easy. In fact, I only actually died twice in my whole playthrough of this game, and both of those were at the same spot on one level where there's some tricky platforming sections. Other than that, I actually found it kinda hard to die, and honestly there was times where I had low health 1 minute, but then it was all suddenly restored the next, and I had no idea why. I must have picked something up, but I really don't remember doing it. Ah well. This game isn't going to blow you away, but you know what, it's not a bad game. You can play through it once just to say you've done it, and then you probably never have to play it ever again. RoboCop vs Terminator almost came out for the NES too. I say almost as it was never actually released, but there is a prototype out there if you're so inclined. And in fact, the prototype pretty much seems to be complete as far as I can tell. And the sad thing is, it's actually pretty damn good. It's what you'd expect, it's a side-scrolling action game, and first off, the game looks fantastic. The graphics here are excellent, the sprites are quite small, but it works really well, and there's so much detail on the levels, with everything moving fast and smoothly, with little to no slowdown, and more impressively, no sprite flicker, which is very rare. Now, this would have come out very late in the life of the console, so that would explain it. The actual gameplay is great though. RoboCop controls really well and can shoot in most directions. You have your pistol as your main weapon, and I did manage to find one other weapon, but that was on a few different levels, so whether or not that would have been in the final release I don't know, maybe there would have been more. Even so, that weapon did kind of seem basically the same as the pistol, but with a slightly different sprite. The levels themselves are all fairly large and have a lot of platforming in them. Again, you'll be climbing and swinging in lots of places. There's a ton of enemies, from humans to Terminators, and they're all fun to fight. What's cool is that the first few Terminators you meet, you can't actually kill by shooting them. You have to knock them off ledges or into hazards, which is a really nice touch. They do act as bosses the first few times you do meet them, but later in the game you can just shoot them to bits. You'll find health and lives in the levels, and I think you get points, but the numbers are hard to read as they seem a bit jumbled up in the top left corner, and I never really knew what they meant. I'm assuming this is something they would have sorted out before actually releasing the game. The music is impressive too and sounds really good, and actually made me think of the Batman game a lot of the time. Honestly, it's a real shame that this was never released, and it really is one of the best NES games I've played in a while. I didn't actually manage to beat the game as I got stuck on a level where you have to go through a bunch of doors to find the exit, and no matter where I went, I always seemed to end up in the same place going round in circles. Now, I'm not sure if that's because it wasn't finished, or because I'm just an idiot and suck at anything that involves a maze. If you do have the means to play this, I really would highly recommend it. I'm guessing it wasn't released as it would have been so late in the console's life, so probably wouldn't have got a load of sales, but it would have been a good note to end on. So far, all of these games have been way better than any of the Terminator or RoboCop games available on those systems. And the final version of RoboCop vs Terminator is this piece of crap for the Super Nintendo. Now, I actually saved this version to play for last, as I was expecting it to be the best one, though I did also think they'd take out the blood, so I was right on one thing. Story-wise, it's the same, but here you actually get some comic book style panels between the levels that attempt to tell you what's going on, though it doesn't really help as everything is so vague and they take forever to actually go through, so you end up skipping them most of the time. Graphically, the game is good, but not as good as the Mega Drive version by a long shot. Everything has been given a more comic style to it, and even the enemies look a lot less realistic and more cartoony. I'm guessing this was another censorship thing. RoboCop in particular looks a bit more goofy, and there's details like the fact that you get a sweet muzzle flash on RoboCop when shooting in the Mega Drive version that you don't get here, that just makes it feel a bit cheaper. In fact, that's just how this game feels overall. It just feels a lot cheaper, and like they didn't put as much effort in. The levels are similar, but not the same. They all share the same theme, but play completely differently to the Mega Drive versions, with different layouts. You don't get secondary objectives here, and it's all just a straightforward case of getting to the end of the level, though it's a lot harder to do so, but mainly thanks to bullshit design. In this version of the game, RoboCop seems to really hate women, and I'm sure most of the enemies here are female. There's also a ton of gun turrets everywhere, and they all spray bullets mercilessly and are very hard to avoid. Also, enemies respawn at a crazy rate here unless you keep moving forward. You literally can stand in one place forever just killing the same enemy that will constantly walk back on the screen after you've killed them. Also, there's hazards that fall from the sky with little to no warning on a lot of levels that are almost impossible to dodge. Enemies do occasionally drop health though, which kinda helps. When you do get to the Terminator levels though, that's when everything ramps up to 11. They're a real pain in the ass, as they're much harder to kill here. They'll also hunt you down a lot more efficiently, climbing ladders and doing what they need to get to you. But the main issue is that they just take a ton of shots to put down, and then when you do kill one, another one will just almost instantly spawn in again. On top of this, you've got robot dogs that you have to aim down to shoot at, which is awkward, but they move so fast and come out of nowhere that you'll almost always take a hit before you get the chance to kill them. They have tried to mix things up with cool boss fights, and there's one where you fight a hunter-killer, but it's just a case of hoping that you do more damage to it before it kills you, as there's bullets coming from everywhere that are very hard to avoid. And, unlike the other games, here if you do die, you go back to the start of the level. There's no checkpoints as far as I can tell, which just sucks, as the levels are long and hard, just like Beltbuckle Bill. Interestingly, they did actually throw in a Mode 7 first person level, and I actually kinda like it, you know. It's very basic, and you just have to kill a few Terminators, and it was over in just a few minutes. Again, just like Beltbuckle Bill. But it was a nice change. I managed to get a couple of levels after that, and then I just couldn't get any further as the game was just kicking my ass. Thankfully there are passwords, and I needed these a lot, as if I did manage to beat a level, I'd pretty much be on my last legs when I did so these were definitely needed for me to get anywhere. I really thought this was going to be a great game after playing the others, but it just let me down in almost every way. This is still the best RoboCop or Terminator game on the Super Nintendo, but that's not saying much. I wouldn't recommend this game, and amazingly, I'd probably say it's my least favourite of the bunch. So there you go, that's every version of RoboCop vs Terminator that was ever made and almost released. But that's not all for today, as I have a bonus game, which is actually one I recorded footage for and was meant to include in my Terminator video, but I totally forgot. So here is Terminator Salvation for the Xbox 360. It's a third-person action game based on the movie that took me 3 days to watch because it was so boring I kept turning it off. It's set in the future, and you are John Connor on his mission to fulfill his destiny and stop Skynet. As it's based on a movie, you probably have low expectations, and you should keep them low, as this is about as generic, boring and lifeless as it gets. You spend every level on a very linear path, running with your squad of generic nobodies until you're forced to stop and battle a bunch of robots using shotguns, machine guns and rockets. As was the trend at the time, there is a focus on hiding behind the conveniently placed crumbled walls, cars and other mounds of stuff. Then you want to pop out, take a few shots and hide behind the cover again so your health can refill. Something I did like though is that all the enemies have weak spots, which are basically the glowing red parts on them, so you want to aim for these for massage damage. This is actually quite necessary to do, as otherwise most enemies take most of your ammo to put down. The controls here are fine and exactly what you'd expect, and to be fair, they actually work quite well. Graphically, the game isn't very impressive, the Terminators look alright, but the animation on them is a bit disappointing. The human characters all look kinda bad though, with crappy character models that are, as expected, as generic as they come. The levels themselves have some nice effects every now and then, but it's all just grey and brown, which I guess is to be expected as you're playing a post-apocalyptic world, so it can almost be forgiven. The game is mercifully short though, and I actually completed the whole thing in about 4 hours with relatively little challenge. As is the case with a lot of games like this, the final level was incredibly disappointing. There isn't really a boss or anything, you just have to make it to the end of the level and there's a cutscene showing what happens next. Boring. They do try to mix things up with bits on rails, and these are fine, but they really just don't have enough challenge to be exciting. Overall, this is really what most people would probably expect from a licensed game, an obviously rushed, generic action game. Now, it actually doesn't play badly, it's just so mind-numbingly average and forgettable that it's just not worth your time. You can play it in 2-player co-op, which is a nice touch, but let's be honest, no one's going to want to play it with you, are they? I will say though that the music is pretty damn good. But yeah, don't bother with this one, not that you were planning on playing it anyway. So there you go. What was your favourite game in this video? Let me know in the comments below. On screen now you can see where you can follow me, so why not do so? I've got loads of great content for everyone to enjoy. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, hasta la vista, and we'll see you next time. Creep.